I was lucky enough to get some funding to embark on a research project at the University of New England, and I started out by interviewing people who were doing the same kind of work as me in environmental education, but were using theatre or visual arts. So this is the company from Canada called the Evergreen Theatre. They use performance a lot with their work with school children to educate about climate change or some of those kinds of issues. Another company I interviewed was Leapfish, based in Sydney. They also use performance as part of their workshops. They did two sets of workshops, one to educate children and their families to reduce energy consumption in their home, and another to reduce water consumption. And so they incorporated their performance but also ran workshops and that kind of thing. And 3 months after their workshops, the families that were involved reduced their daily electricity consumption by 15% and daily water consumption by 11%. So I guess this use of the arts was to create a cognitive interest in nature, to get people educated about nature. So I guess the Tree Veneration Society does similar sort of things with some of its workshops. It's using the arts and other experiences in their workshops to educate people to improve the educative experience. So that was one line of thinking. And part of that also, I interviewed a lot of... I've always loved political cartoons, so I interviewed a lot of political cartoonists, including Bruce Petty, who died recently, unfortunately. I love that cartoon by Cobb. But I just love the way cartoons could condense information to really provoke social change through condensing that, providing a voice of dissent. So this as part of that whole getting a cognitive connection to nature was also evoking indignation in degradation. So, either through political type cartoons, or this is a really nice example that came to one of our conferences from Jill Sampson. There's a place called the Bimblebox Nature Reserve in central Queensland, and it's apparently quite a rare area of forest or woodland, and there's a big coal mine that was proposed to be built there, which would have destroyed that nature reserve. It's something like 153 plus species of birds lived in that reserve, and Jill, who is a local landholder in that area and an artist, got over 450 artists involved, both visual artists and audio artists, and they created this exhibition to highlight the birds that lived in that Bimblebox Reserve. And I heard recently that they actually won the court case against, I think it was one of the big coal mining company, I think, by Clive Palmer, who was going to mine that. They actually won and it was stopped. So I guess that's another kind of invoking indignation about degradation through the arts is an important line of thought. But I also wondered about, we've all got pictures on the wall, I'm sure, or music that we listen to that isn't necessarily educative or didactic, but just evokes a kind of connection to nature. And I sort of posed the question, well, does this kind of art have an effect on people's attitudes? And how does it? How could it? So I interviewed a large number of artists as well as people who worked on the environment in some ways. Because I was working in the natural resources area, it was often farmers. And I also interviewed what I call extensionists. That's people who take scientific information and pass it on to farmers. And I came up with this kind of model of chains of inspiration where the natural environment inspired the artist inspired the extensionist inspired the person who worked on the environment, and the person works on the environment. But I've made those arrows one way, but of course they go in all directions. So, for example, one of the farming families I interviewed were the Fentons, who lived in southern Victoria and had done... I'll show you another slide of their farm. They started out with a very barren landscape, saline affected, no trees had been left in the landscape, and they revegetated and restored the wetlands. They were very influenced by an extensionist called Rod Bird, who pioneered agroforestry in Victoria. And when I went to talk to Rod, he could cite several artists that inspired him, they affirmed his belief in nature, such as Neil Douglas, John Olsen and Michael Leunig. So that's the kind of example of the chains of inspiration that I came up with. And these are all the people I interviewed, and looks a bit like a cell with lots of organelles in it. A more recent example of this kind of artwork, I guess, where the art creates an empathy for the natural environment is some ephemeral artworks. This was another person who presented at one of the conferences and Arc Circus living sculptures, where they worked with Indigenous performers and dancers and acrobats, circus performers, doing this wonderful How the Birds Got Their Colours at the Swell Sculpture Festival. So this is a kind of a diagram to show how that kind of art can sort of work. So pro-environmental behaviour can be predicted by what a person knows about nature. That makes sense. If a person adopts pro-environmental behaviour, it stands to reason that it's because they know stuff, or that they're indignant about degradation in some way. And a cognitive interest in nature or indignation about degradation come about through our own experiences of past and present experiences with the environment. But it's been found that an emotional affinity towards nature also is a strong predictor of pro-environmental behaviour. So if the artist also has direct experience of nature and land degradation, they produce art which can then affect all three of those little bubbles down the middle: the emotional affinity towards nature, cognitive interest in nature, and indignation about degradation. So another part of my work, I was involved in some very big case study events. There was the Nova Anglica event that I described earlier, where I went back and interviewed people who'd been involved in that. But also, this was another event that took place in Arboreal, the Plague and the Moonflower, which is an oratorio, an ecological oratorio. So I think Handel's Messiah with a strong ecological kind of overlay. And something like 300 people participated in this in the Armadale community. It was performed in 2002, and then we later took it to the Woodford Folk Festival, all 300 performers, and camped up there and performed it to about 10,000 people up there. There was an orchestra, children's choir, adult choir, dancers, Aboriginal performers, jugglers, actors. It was really big, and it was an amazing experience to be part of. So the basic story of the oratorio: the plague demon represents humanity destroying nature. We made a huge puppet that was about 6 metres high out of 3,000 plastic shopping bags that we tied together, and it rose up in the arena. And the moonflower was the kind of celebratory sort of thing, uplifting, very beautiful piece. It's a thing that I called these kinds of events celebrationist events, because they involve lots of art forms: performance art, visual arts, multi-dance, etc. And when I interviewed people after what effect did it have on them, I surveyed participants and audience members. Something like 2/3 of respondents said it made them intend to change their behaviour towards the environment in some way. I won't go into this in a lot of detail because we don't have a heap of time, but other questions I asked them, something like over 70% said it moved their emotions, made them reflect about their relationship with the environment, made them feel strongly about the environment. Pride in community was very strong, and it affirmed their beliefs in some way. So, and over 40%, particularly the young people involved, said they learnt about aspects of the environment through participating in it. So it did have, had some big results, and we just went back. We just had the 20th anniversary of that back in Armadale just a few weeks ago. So I've talked about arts being used to help communication and to create empathy for the nature. Another pathway, or another way that the arts can influence attitudes to the environment is where the arts are actually integrated into ecologically sustainable development in some way. So this was an example by an artist called Claire Tracy, who was very involved in big organisations like Flight Centre and various municipal councils. It's a sculpture she made out of plastic waste. And And the effect that she had on the organisation that she worked with, Flight Centre, was the example I'm thinking of. Through having the artist involved in the organisation doing this work, it actually changes the whole philosophy of the organisation to reduce their waste. There's another way where arts can be kind of catalyse ecologically sustainable development through some sort of transformative action, through the reclaiming of restoring physical environments. So this is back in Armidale, a large gully, Black Gully, which goes through Armidale. It's had an ecological restoration project running there for many years, and each year there's a big music festival that takes place on the site as well. And EcoArt's had an ephemeral art project where we had all these ephemeral artworks put into the spot too. And there's some nice examples that have come through some of our conferences where arts have been incorporated into ecological restoration. So these are the three pathways. So getting to the end of my talk now, where I came up with this model to like conceptualise or to think about how the arts can affect people's attitudes to the environment. First is where the arts help communicating information. So that might be by creating a cognitive interest in nature, by sort of getting people to think about their awareness of the consequences of their actions, and particularly we see this in environmental education, or where the arts create some sort of emotional indignation about degradation in some way. So in other words, there's sort of some sort of critical engagement with the issue and a degree of persuasion. The second pathway is where the arts create empathy for the environment, where they create an emotional affinity for nature. This is sometimes called lyrical expression. And I'm sure we can all think of lots of examples of art that does this. And the third pathway is where the arts are sort of help catalyse ecologically sustainable development, where the arts are actually integrated into some kind of ecologically sustainable development program. That might be transformative action where the arts are put into a reclaiming or restoring a physical environment, or some other kind of ecologically sustainable program. So that's where I came to at the end of my research. After I finished that, then we formed EcoArt Australis, which Louise talked about, and have organised 3 conferences since then. And 2 of those conferences we published the proceedings. For Louise is in both those books. And I've got some brochures outside there, which if anyone's interested in following that up. And since I've retired, I've been writing comic books. So first pathway stuff, helping communicate. So the first one was on Days by Dieback, which is, describing dieback in a comic book, and I've just finished one on climate change. So I've got a few of those outside if anyone want to look at those. Okay, thanks.
Goodness, thank you so much, David. That was really wonderful. I mean, there's so much to take away again from David's talk. I mean, how the arts can influence pro-environmental behaviour. Emotion. I love the emotive action in relation to indignation, transformative action, reclaiming the land, cognitive action in relation to interest in nature, and of course emotional affinity. Anyway, we will have some time at the end to ask some questions and to talk more about these things.